Welcome to the True Raven session on Animism, Shamanic Journeying, and Therapeutic Shamanism with Paul Francis. Today, we will dive into Shamanic Journeying, what it is, how can we learn it, and why it is something that can really deepen and enrich our everyday shamanic practice. Hi Paul, how are you?
I'm really good, thank you, yeah.
Let's dive right in. What exactly is Shamanic Journeying and where do we journey to?
To explain that, I think I just need to really briefly recap what animism is as opposed to shamanism. So animism is the living experience that everything around you is alive and conscious, even rocks, mountains, trees, everything. And all our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived as animists. In most of those communities, depending how you define the word shamanism, there were people who were animists who also had another special ability. And that was the ability to enter a trance state, to leave their bodies, to travel what are known as the shamanic realms, to gather the healing teaching and information from those realms and then bring it back and to use it as service for the community. That essentially is what a shaman is, as opposed to an animist. A shaman is an animist plus this ability to leave their body at will and travel the shamanic realms. So in doing that, in what's called the shamanic journey, then, what shamans experience is there is another reality behind this physical reality, divided into sort of specific areas and realms. To be able to do that, to be able to leave their bodies and travel the shamanic realms, involves what's sometimes referred to as hollowing out. Shamans say that things are as they are because of the stories they're telling themselves. And most people are completely caught up in their middle world stories about who they are, their middle world identities, who they tell themselves they are, who their families have told them they are, who their work and so on tells them they are. So intrinsic to shamanism is the ability to untie yourself from those stories, at least enough to be able to leave those behind and then start to travel the shamanic realms.
So, to enter shamanic realities, we need to put our stories, the ego, aside so it doesn't interfere with journeying. Who is then leading the journey?
There's two parts to that question, really. One is that, yes, you need to be able to temporarily at least, to be able to untie yourself from your middle world identity. And so it does beg the question on what's left. What is the bit of you that's journeying? So most people listening to this will probably have some familiarity with mindfulness practice and meditation. So take breath practice. You sit and you watch your breath, and then as any thoughts come in, you basically watch the thoughts. So in a way, you're sort of stepping back from your mind. And what you're doing is cultivating what we call the witness, essentially, the part that can witness these things without being caught up in them. And that's really intrinsic to good shamanic practice as well, is the ability to be able to cultivate a witness part of you who can step back from your day-to-day self. We sometimes call this in shamanism learning to stalk yourself, like literally sort of track yourself. So you can spot when you're getting entangled and caught up in things and step back from it, essentially. So that's the part that does the journeying primarily, is this witness part of you. It gets more complicated, but that's the basics of it. That isn't really who should be leading the journey, though. In most shamanic practices, it's said the good journey should be spirit-led, not led by the shamanic practitioner. So essentially, the journeys are led by the shaman's guides, those spirit beings and teachers. Sometimes you see the phrase the hollow bone or the hollow flute being used. So the idea is that the shaman becomes this hollow vessel, this bone flute that the guides can work through, essentially. So the shaman's like a conduit for the shamanic guides. There's some truth to that. In reality, though, the idea of submitting yourself completely to the guides to become just a conduit to them is something we only see really emerge in shamanism with the emergence of more hierarchical ways of being that we see as we turn away from shamanism and animism. In reality, shaman works in partnership with the guides. So yes, the guides are leading the journey, but that's because they're better, they know what they're doing more. But it's not a handing your power over relationship. It's a bit like if you were going on a hunt, you'd give the leadership over to the person who's best at doing it. And then if it was about a decision when to move to the winter camp for the tribe, they'd refer to the people who were best equipped to make that decision, and so on and so on. So when you're journeying, you defer to your guides in terms of they're better equipped, they're more experienced than you. But it's not a hierarchical or power over relationship. It's not one of submission.
Fascinating. Tell me more about the shamanic worlds we enter when doing a shamanic journey. What are they like?
When you go into the shamanic realms, all cultures across the world seem to have experienced them as being divided up into three quite distinct realms. Of course, in modern Western culture, we killed our shamans off mostly a long time ago, so we lost a lot of our terminology. So when Michael Harner, who founded core shamanism, was very much responsible for a lot of the rebirth of shamanism we see these days. When he was putting that together, he had to come up with a term for these three realms. And he called them the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world, because we do experience them in some ways as being arranged spatially like that. So just a very quick description of them. So the upper world, probably the easiest way for most people in the modern era to conceptualize it is, of course, religions, when they come along, pinch it and they call it heaven, essentially. So the upper world is what most people would associate with spirituality. I mean, in shamanism, everything's spiritual, but the upper world is the realm of gods and goddesses, ascended beings, all the angels, all that sort of thing. However you dress them up, basically. And it's the realm of sort of healthy detachment, healthy perspective. It's a realm of healing, of compassion, ethics, and so on and so on. The lower world, by contrast, is the realm of Mother Earth and nature, and the realm of what we call the peoples. So as well as us, the human people, the realm of the plant people, the animal people, the stone people. In our culture has been given quite a bad press, really, because basically when religions come along, mostly they said that up is good and down is bad, essentially. The masculine is good and the feminine is bad. But in shamanic cultures, there wasn't any such hierarchical judgments. And then we have the middle world, which is the realm we live in. It's our day-to-day world. Both the physical stuff we can see and the stuff that most people don't tune into, but shamans and other people who are sensitive can see, the sort of spirit beings who live in this reality. The upper world and lower world are both places of love and healing. The middle world, of course, can be, but it's also a mixed bag. It's a much trickier place, essentially. But those three realms have very distinctive feels. They need different approaches and techniques when you're in them. And understanding them is key to doing any good shamanic work, really.
Is there a sequence in which we should enter different realms? Should we start in any of them particularly?
Most of the teaching I've witnessed over the years in this culture is people just tend to get thrown in at the deep end. And so what tends to happen is people end up doing middle world journeys because that's the area we're most familiar with. Sometimes that's fine, other times it can be much more problematic because the middle world is a very mixed bag. It's like, yes, there's beautiful things in this reality and there's, things that feel weird or uncomfortable and dodgy as well. So what I try to do is teach people in a much more grounded way so that they don't have disturbing experiences. I basically asked my guides, how should I teach this? And when it came to this, my guide said, go to plant, ask plant. If you think about how a plant grows, a seed grows, the first thing a seed does is it puts its roots down into Mother Earth and then it draws Mother Earth up into it. That's the first thing we do is we should reconnect to nature, basically, and to the earth and to grounding and really draw that into us. Then what a seed does is it reaches up to Father Sun, Father Sky, the upper world, if you like, and then it draws energy from that down into it. And once it's done that, it starts to grow and expand into the middle world, really. And that's the sequence I'll try to teach in, basically. Lower world first, really grounding yourself, then the upper worlds, and then when you do that, then you can approach the middle world in a very sort of sane and grounded way.
Yeah, nature is a really great teacher, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always what I go back to when I've got a question.
I understand that in your teaching, in therapeutic shamanism, you place a lot of importance on understanding the difference between the realms. Why is this?
Yeah, it's true. And it does sometimes puzzle people. And particularly with my students, I mean, they will tell you I go on and on and on and on about this. And the way I've written my books as well reflects that. I mean, the first book is very much a lower world book. The next two books then take that further. The fourth book then will be the upper world book. And only then will I start writing middle world books, really. So why do I do this? It's because the modern human middle world is extraordinarily different to the middle world our hunter-gatherer shamanic ancestors knew and understood and had to deal with. We're living in very different times. So compared to the middle world our human ancestors understood, our shamanic ancestors, the middle world most people live in these days is extraordinarily cut off from nature. I mean, even if you're living out in the countryside, you know, most countryside is very much domesticated and tamed these days. Hunter-gatherers really, they were brought up in nature, and so they really understood what an eagle was, if there were eagles in that area, or what a tree was. Most people these days, they don't know what they're looking at, let alone how to talk with a tree or an eagle, or understand how different it is from us and so on. So yeah, there's the cut-off from nature. Our modern middle world as well is absolutely full of stories that from an animist point of view are incredibly wonky. Stories like the myth of human supremacy, the idea that we are the top of some kind of pyramid of hierarchy, that other animals are below us and plants below them, and so on and so on. The modern human middle-world as well is absolutely full of repressed material. In the process of so-called civilizing ourselves, what we had to do is domesticate ourselves to fit in to the modern culture. And what that meant was having to repress an awful lot of material. And that doesn't go away, it just festers basically and bubbles up all over the place. And so we've created a whole realm of seething stuff, basically, clutter and weird energies and weird dynamics and all sorts of stuff. That if you read accounts of from anthropologists who were living with the actual hunter-gatherers, none of that kind of stuff went on, really. So we live in a much messier middle world. The middle world is cut off from nature, where most people don't even understand what nature really is, full of all these wonky thoughts and so on. So unless you train yourself to wake up to this and to spot this modern human middle world stuff, what happens is inevitably you take it with you on your journey. You don't know better. So a lot of the shamanic practice I see these days, people's journeys initially are very full of human middle world stuff, basically, full of their own unconscious projections, ideas, agendas, so on and so on. Ideas of human supremacy, we just take it for granted that there's the superior species. All of this is quite unconscious. In teaching students, it's a question of constantly pointing it out to them when this middle world stuff is bleeding in, and eventually they kind of learn to spot it themselves. The quality of their journeying just transforms. And it's not just the lower world we've done this with as well. Most people's idea of gods and goddesses these days bear no relationship to how our animist ancestors understood the upper world at all. You know, in the Bible it says that God made us in his, of course, because it is a patriarchy, in his own image. It's completely the other way around. we've made the gods and goddesses in our own image. We've invented these crazy psychotic beings that we think are upperworld beings, and they're not. So we're disconnected really from the lower world and from the upper world. And if you journey without awareness of that, you'll just be journeying in the middle world. Even if you think it's the upper world or lower world, you have to train yourself to decontaminate yourself, to decolonize your mind from our modern domesticated thinking, essentially. Which might sound very complicated and difficult. It's actually fairly easy. I mean, I've been teaching people how to do this for a long time now, and it takes people, a few weeks, maybe a few months to start to get the hang of the difference between the lower world and the middle world, and notice when middle world stuff is bleeding in. And once people do that, you just develop a feel for the middle world stuff and a feel for the lower. They feel completely different, and you know when you're in one and when you're in the other. It's not actually that complicated. You just need to know to do it, basically.
So when we do learn to journey and enter the real shamanic realms, then are they real in the same way our everyday life is? Do we experience them in the same way as in our daily life?
They're definitely not the same as every ordinary reality. I mean, shamans are very clear about this. They talk about the difference in ordinary reality and shamanic reality, so they're different. It's sometimes described as the difference between logos and mythos. So logos is things that are literally true, which is, how mostly this physical reality operates. And mythos are things that are mythologically true. They are stories to live by, or stories to inform us or guide us, essentially. Mythos is not just imagination. If you imagine a world with no mythos, apart from anything, it would be a terrible world. There'd be no art, no music, no literature, no poetry, no dancing, nothing. It would also be a world without any healthy stories to make sense of your life and to help guide you. So mythos is of equal importance to logos. It's different though. So when people start journeying, it's usual for a large percentage of what they experience to be made up. It is just imagination, essentially. And that's how it should be. When students are learning to journey, I say just forget about whether you make it up. Just go for it. Just use your imagination. Just make it up. Give yourself permission. What happens in doing that is maybe 90% of that is just made up. But there'll be about 10% of it when they go on Google afterwards and say, what's the meaning of, badger or hawthorn or whatever came up in journey. Their mouths drop open. They kind of sit there and think, there's no way I could have just imagined that. A plant might come up in journey, they don't even know what it is, so they spend time researching it and they look up its properties and it's like, oh my goodness, how's that possible? So that you start to again get a feel of the difference between when you are just making stuff up and when actually it isn't made up, when you're onto something. And the more you do that, the less your journeys become just made up and the more they become authentic mythos, basically. It's a bit like if you think about art or poetry or music or story writing. When people start off, it's hard work and things, but as people become really good at it, their work develops an authenticity. It speaks a deeper truth, essentially, to people. It moves people. You can't reduce it down to just fact. You can't say a piece of music or a painting or a great novel is factually true. It's about the truth of it on another level, the mythos of it. So that's what journeys are really about.
If we experience the journey in metaphors that are mythos and not literally true, how do we then make sense of what we encounter in a journey?
The thing with mythos is we need to use metaphors or similes or analogies or symbols and to make sense of it. So when you journey, what you are being shown by your guides is often just a whole pile of metaphors and symbols and so on. So how then do you make sense of it? My favourite quote from anybody ever in all of time is a quote from Carl Jung, the founder of depth psychology. He said, one doesn't achieve enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So in other words, when you go down into this rich metaphorical stuff, you emerge out of it with this whole collection of things that you then need to make sense of. You need to bring them into consciousness. Doing a shamanic journey, although you can get a lot immediately from it, a lot of the healing then comes from unpacking it after the journey and making sense of it. A process that can go on for hours, days, weeks, literally even years. The first thing you start with, what does this mean for me? First, what does it mean for you? Because the person who really knows its truth is you. Having said that, then there is a place for doing some research on it. Sometimes I know in the shaman community people get really snotty about this. They say, oh, I don't want to look stuff up. I just want to find out the meaning for myself. However, if you've been raised in a shamanic culture, that would be seen as arrogant, frankly. It's like, because you would be rejecting all the knowledge and wisdom of your elders and ancestors who've gone before you. As well as being shown techniques and how to journey, you would have been taught a whole body of knowledge that you would have had to learn. Nowadays, of course, in the absence of many of us having authentic shamanic teachers, we've got Google for this stuff, so books and so on. So, after a journey, you can go look stuff up. It doesn't mean you have to take it on board. Some of what you read might not make sense, but the point for being respectful for the experience and teachings of the people who've gone before us as well.
Is going on a shamanic journey always visual? Like going into a cinema or...
Yeah, that's another great question. A lot of people assume it's going to be visual. When I first started teaching shamanism, probably about 90% of people could get it fairly easily. It was the 10% who couldn't get it used to really bother me. I spent a lot of time asking them what actually happened. So there'd be a number of things, but one of the things happened was they were expecting it to be very visual. And actually, when we really drilled down into what they experienced, they were experiencing things, it just wasn't visual. So sometimes it's just more like a sixth sense. You just sense what's around you or what something is doing or saying. Sometimes it's more about gut feelings. Sometimes it's more about, I journey a lot in smell. Sometimes they're very, very tactile. Sometimes it can be all the senses, really. And in fact, sight can get in the way because we're primates. Sight is our primary sense, and it's what we use to scan the middle world and look for danger and food. And so in a lot of shamanic cultures, when you journey, you do use a blindfold, or it's done in the dark. And the idea is because sight tends to keep us in the middle world, so it's a good idea to cut it off, essentially. For about a year or two in my own shamanic practice, I used to regularly, when I did a journey, I'd go down to the shamanic lower world and I'd ask my guides to blindfold me in the journey so that I couldn't do the journey using sight at all. So I learned to do journeys just by touch or just by smell or just by hearing and so on. So it's not just visual, so it's not watching, but nor is it just like listening to music either. It's not a passive thing. In this culture, we're used to sitting there and having things brought to us, essentially. It's not like that. It's sometimes called the path of willpower. It involves you making stuff happen, you getting up and interacting. It's a co-creation between you and spirit. A bit, again, like trying to write music or painting. It's like you have to put the work in. You can sense what's there. You have to wrestle it into form, essentially.
Tell me more about guides. Who are they and how can we meet them?
So this comes back to knowing what realm you're in. When a lot of people start off journeying in this culture, they end up, like I say, just journeyed in the middle world. So the guides they meet will tend to be middle world beings as well. And a lot of people come to our classes already thinking they've got guides. They've got some, I don't know, Chinese doctor from the 4th century AD or something. And when I started off my shamanic work, my guides were all middle world guides too. These days, what I teach my students is to start off in the lower world and to start off with the lower world guides, and then to move to the upper world and the upper world guides. So if we come to lower world guides, the lower world is the realm of nature. So your first guide is generally what's known as a power animal. It's not an individual, it's the whole of that species of animal. It represents what we call the oversoul of the animal. The reason for it being an animal is it's different enough to take you out of being human, to start connecting you with nature and the other human, but not so strange and hard to relate to that, it's actually not much use when you're starting off. So it's something you can really interact with and fall in love with and develop a deep relationship with, but it's not human is the point. So it takes you out of that. Once you do that, then you develop other guides. You meet usually a lower world human guide who's like a hunter-gatherer from the lower world, and like I say, upper world guides and so on. One thing I want to be clear about is shamans are very, very clear on this, that the guides are real. They're not imaginary at all. It's something as a psychotherapist, my other hat as well as being a shamanic practitioner, I wrestled with over the years, because psychotherapists tend to think, oh, this is just active imagination and so on. And I've just become very clear on my experience of it, is the guides are real. They exist independent of you.
So a power animal is not an individual animal, but an oversoul. Tell me more about this.
I hope you can see this on here. So if I stick my fingers up like that, each of my fingers, say, represents individual people. Okay, so there's you and there's me, and there's your partner, I can hear in the background, and my partner downstairs and so on, We're individual people in the middle world, Now, if we look below the middle world, at this, we're all actually one thing. So if we drop down to the lower world, things that are individuals in the middle world all actually come from a single thing. So for us individual humans in this world, if we drop down, we're all actually part of human with a capital H. The oversoul that all individual humans spring from, essentially. And that's the same of individual panthers. They all come from panther with a capital P in the lower world. All dogs come from the oversoul of dog with a capital D, and so on and so on. Let's say we let go of our individuality, our middle world identity, and we can drop down to become more human with a capital H in the lower world. Think of these as tips of twigs on a tree, okay? And if you start tracing them down, they start to converge, Yeah. So now if we look over, we'll see another branch with twigs emerging into the middle world, and this will be our nearest relative. So we'll look over and we'll see chimpanzee, and maybe another next to that will be bonobo and gorilla, the great apes essentially. Okay, if we trace those further back still, those, like again tracing the tree towards the trunk, those will converge into a bigger branch called great ape. And if we trace that, we'll see other branches beside us, the felines, the cat people and the dog people and so on and so on, the bear family, all converging to a great branch called mammal. Okay, next to mammal, we'll have other big branches. We'll have fish, going up into all the different kinds of fish, and reptile and so on and so on, If we trace all of those down, those come to animal. Next to animal is plant, another great trunk. Plant, of course, branches off into mosses and conifers and flowering plants and so on, then popping up as individual daffodils and daisies and oak trees in the middle. So we've got these two great branches, animal and plants, and if we follow those down, they come from the single trunk of the stone people that everything is made of. The chemical elements, the rocks, the minerals, and so on and so on. And if we follow that down, its roots are in Mother Earth that gave birth to it. So this is the tree of life. This is what the lower world is essentially. It's this great big huge tree of all the peoples. that we are part of. And that's part of the point of going to the world, is to remember we are actually part of something bigger than us. We're part of a tree. We're part of an ecology, essentially. We're not supreme or better than.
And we can experience being that different oversouls in journeys?
Yes, so if you can unknot yourself from your middle world identity of who you are, Paul Francis, whoever I tell the stories I tell myself, and then start travelling down, I can travel down to human, and then I can travel up. It's quite easy to travel up into another animal, essentially, because they're not that different to us, particularly mammals. So you can experience being wolf, or experience being panther. You can experience being eagle quite easily. Most people can do this really easily. When I used to teach face-to-face courses on the introductory days, we'd do this before lunch, basically. This is not difficult to learn to do. And then you can start travelling down even deeper and start coming up as plants as well. Trees are usually fairly easy, but you can also experience being lettuce or carrot or different things. And then harder, because they're further away from us. They're not less conscious, they're just conscious in ways that are very difficult. You can start to experience being rock, or being waterfall, being mountain, and so on and so on. And what comes out of doing this is a real profound sense of love and connection to these things. This is why in animist cultures they talk about the other people, the other animals, plant and the stone people, as being people. We're all part of one thing. And they talk about brother wolf, sister eagle. They talk about brother oak tree and sister mountain. They recognise the other animals, plants and the stone people are our kin. We're all related.
Most people are more familiar with dreams and meditation than with shamanic journeying. Are there any similarities between those three?
It depends what on earth you mean by meditation dreams, of course. They're big words. Some meditation dreams can be very shamanic and some definitely aren't. One aspect of meditation is to cultivate mindfulness, awareness, to cultivate what we call the witness, this part of us who can step back and let go of the things we're entangled up in. Doing that is an essential part of getting good at shamanism. So the extent to which you can step back from your middle world stuff and your thoughts and agendas and things and be in witness, to have that distance, is the extent to which you can then go off and journey. So that aspect of meditation and shamanism go hand in hand, really. Dreams, well, in a dream you are leaving your body mostly and travelling other realms. Most dreams, basically, you stay in the middle world. So most dreams are about your middle world life, or sometimes it's trying to deal with the repressed material. So, when you're at work, you pretend you like your boss, but actually in your dreams, they become a monster or something. So most dreams are middle world stuff. Sometimes you will have a dream that goes beyond that. Interestingly, shamanism is sometimes described as learning to dream whilst you're awake. Okay, to leave your body and enter the non-physical realms while you're awake. But in that case, most of the time you're going to be wanting, certainly initially, to be going to the lower world and the upper worlds before you start dealing with your middle world stuff, essentially.
How can one learn shamanic journeying? What would you suggest to someone just starting their shamanic path?
You'll sometimes see it said that it's a special calling, and in some cultures that was the tradition. Honestly, my experience of it is, although some people are definitely better at it than others, most people can learn this, or at least most people can learn animism and the basics of shamanic practice. Most people can learn to start experiencing the world around them as being alive and conscious again. Because it's normal to us, it's how we used to all be, it's how we all used to live. In terms of how to do it, for most people there isn't a authentic face-to-face teacher they can go to. You can learn a lot from the books. I was very sceptical when I first wrote the book. My guides were nagging me to do them. Eventually I gave in. I honestly didn't know how well it would work. But I've had hundreds and hundreds of emails over the years now. from people saying they learnt to journey through the books. And now we have the online courses as well. People can sometimes get a bit snotty about books or online stuff. And like I say, I was sceptical myself. The thing is, if you were living in a shamanic culture, even if you had a face-to-face teacher, all they would do is tell you some stuff and then how to experiment for yourself, how to experience it. True shamanic learning comes from a little bit of teaching and guidance and then trying it out on yourself. It's a direct learning experience. In a way, it doesn't really matter whether the little bit of teaching and guidance and suggestions come from a book or a live teacher or a teacher through Zoom. What students do is they go and they practice it themselves and they learn, they experience it. And most people can do it. It's surprisingly easy and joyous, actually, and wonderful to do.
I feel like we could talk for hours. Thank you, Paul, for your time and for sharing your knowledge. I can't wait for the next time.
You're very welcome. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Bye.
Okay, bye, Kaya.
So if you like this session, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel or sign up for the newsletter on our website. There are some exciting themes coming up in the next month. Stay tuned. Bye.